Welcome to 28storms.com. This is your tropical weather update for Thursday, September 8th. We are still closely monitoring Tropical Storm Nate in the southwest Gulf of Mexico, Hurricane Katia just to the west of Bermuda, and of course Tropical Storm Maria located to the east of the Lesser Antilles. This was the first Hurricane Center track forecast when it was upgraded at 4 p.m. yesterday. The Hurricane Center took Nate in a general westerly direction starting this upcoming weekend, and it's basically implying that this would make landfall in eastern Mexico. However, earlier this morning we began to see the models begin to diverge once again. We've seen half of the models continue to take this toward Mexico, whereas we still have a few models that are flip-flopping back and forth with the idea that this could continue northward into the U.S. Central Gulf Coast. So therefore the Hurricane Center is fairly uncertain as to what scenario is more likely, and they really don't like to swing that track back and forth all that much, so therefore they are taking a blend between the two main scenarios, and they are forecasting a rather slow movement with only a gradual bend now to the northwest with time. The spaghetti model plot displays a lot of tracks that really aren't very reliable, but nevertheless this still displays the general model variance that has become increasingly apparent over the last 12 hours, with some of the models still taking this more toward the west, but of course we still have the models taking it closer to the U.S. Central Gulf Coast. One thing the models have come into more agreement on is the fact that upper level conditions are likely to become more favorable over the next 3 to 4 days, and so therefore many of the models are now taking this to a Category 1 minimal hurricane, and in fact there are still some models that even take this to a Category 2 or low-end Category 3 within the next 5 to 6 days. However, it is fairly unlikely that Tropical Storm Nate will significantly intensify over the next 24 to 48 hours. If we go ahead and look at the latest visible imagery, we can see that much of the convection still appears to be displaced just to the south of the surface circulation located right around here, and we can also see that fairly well on the latest enhanced infrared, and that is because we still have some northeasterly wind shear and a lot of dry air still trying to stream into the storm from the northwest Gulf of Mexico. You can still make out all of that dry air over the northwest Gulf quite easily. It's being denoted by these darker colors. You can also make out the upper level load that is cut off from the overall steering in the Ohio Valley. Now if this slides a bit more toward the southwest than forecast, then this could open up a bit more of a southerly fetch over the central Gulf, which would steer this storm more into the central U.S. Gulf Coast. However, if this upper level ridge over northern Mexico begins to slide more toward the east as forecast by some of the other model guidance, then that would turn the storm more toward the west with time into mainland Mexico. The latest raw output from the ship's intensity model is telling me that the model is still sensing some northeasterly wind shear over the next 12 hours, but over time the wind shear is going to start to become more out of the southwest, and that could put a slight cap on the development of the storm. But overall, a southwest flow does appear to be a little bit more favorable compared to what we have now, because those northerly winds are also bringing with it some dry air. Over the next couple of days, we should begin to see a slow drift toward the north. We have the ridge beginning to build in from the western Caribbean, and along the southern and western periphery of that ridge, we should begin to see more of a northerly component, and we still have this large trough over much of the southeast. So as long as we still have the troughing there on the western side of the ridge, the storm should begin to pull more toward the north. However, the question comes later in the medium range as to whether or not this ridging over Texas and northern Mexico will begin to build back more toward the east. And as we advance the GFS forecast, we see that the northerly motion is going to occur in all likelihood, as the trough is expected to persist for at least another 2 to 3 days. But the problem comes within the next 3 to 5 days. The trough is beginning to lift out, and right when you think that the GFS is going to show it turn more toward the northeast, the steering currents begin to break down once again over the northwest Gulf of Mexico, and the storm is essentially forecast to stall for the next 7 days to the south of Lake Charles and Houston and Galveston, Texas. And it's not until a second trough comes in at around day 9 when the storm finally gets pushed off into a general northeasterly direction into Louisiana. For the last several model cycles, the Canadian CMC model has been showing the cutoff low begin to retrograde more toward the southwest, thus carving out a path for this storm to take a more northerly track. However, the model has done a complete turnaround and is showing the storm being lifted toward the north, but then the ridge begins to build back over Texas, and by day 5 and day 6, the storm is being steered more toward the west to the north of Veracruz, Mexico. The 0Z overnight run of the ECMWF European model also seemed to be on the verge of flipping back and forth from a Mexican landfall to a more northerly track, but now the 12Z run just finished and it's in agreement with its previous cycles from yesterday. It shows only a very small turn toward the west over the next 48 hours with hardly any forward movement, but then by day 3 we really begin to see the ridging begin to redevelop over the northwest Gulf as the West Atlantic Ridge and the Texas Ridge begin to connect over the top of the storm, and by day 4 we see that the storm has made landfall near Tampico, Mexico. So the overall thinking here is that Tropical Storm Nate will remain essentially stalled for the next 48 hours, but a gradual turn more toward northeast Mexico is expected, and it's likely to make landfall as a hurricane. But we can easily see that there is still quite a lot of questions regarding the track of this storm. We will have a NOAA jet flying through the Gulf of Mexico taking some upper air observations, and hopefully that will help the model guidance during the overnight tonight. And so maybe we will begin to see a little bit more model agreement tomorrow. So in the meantime, all interests in the Gulf of Mexico are advised to keep a very close watch on Tropical Storm Nate. Turning to the Central Atlantic, we still have Tropical Storm Maria out there. It's barely hanging on to tropical storm strength with maximum sustained winds of 40 miles per hour. It's moving on toward the west at 22 miles per hour, and we have tropical storm watches up for much of the Leeward Islands. The good news is that it's rather unlikely that this storm will really deepen all that much over the next 72 hours, so nothing more than some minor tropical storm force wind gusts and some heavy rains are anticipated as we go into the weekend. Now, as the storm begins to enter the southwest Atlantic, the forecast becomes a little bit more tricky. If it goes directly over Hispaniola, then that could disrupt the low-level inner core of the storm, but if it were to remain just to the north, there are some signs that the upper-level conditions could become a little bit more favorable for development here, so interests in the Bahamas are advised to take a very close look at this storm because it is likely to head off in your general direction by Monday and into Tuesday, and the storm could be intensifying, once again depending on whether or not it makes it to the north of Hispaniola. Turning to the latest satellite imagery, you can see that Maria is really struggling this afternoon. The surface circulation is exposed to the south and west, with much of the strongest convection remaining to the northeast of the center. We can also make that out fairly well on the latest in infrared. And also on the latest water vapor imagery, we can really see what the two main problems are. There is no question about the fact that there is a lot of southwest dry air and wind shear being funneled into the inner core of Tropical Storm Maria, so we're really not anticipating much in the way of any strengthening before the storm begins to pass over the Lesser Antilles. Again, it's really not until this storm gets into the southwest Atlantic where conditions could potentially become a little bit more favorable. Now, in terms of any U.S. East Coast impact, that type of forecast is really far out. This would be at least 7 days away from impacting the East Coast. However, the preliminary indications is that a trough will persist over much of the U.S. eastern seaboard, so we should begin to see this turn more toward the northeast as it begins to get close to the Bahamas. The spaghetti models are in fairly good agreement with the track over the next 72 hours, but we do begin to see some divergence, which is to be expected in the 4 to 5 day range, but overall we should begin to see more of a turn toward the northeast. So that sums up your tropical weather update for this Thursday. Please stay tuned to 28storms.com and Hurricane Tracker app for the latest on Tropical Storm Nate and Tropical Storm Maria out there in the Central Atlantic.